So Maggie, thank you for this interview. In your recent work, you talk about critical cosmopolitanism. Could you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, I can. So I came to theories around cosmopolitanism through a project that I was doing, and I'm still doing, where I do have youth in contact with one another across the globe. And while originally there were literacy aims for that project, it became really clear to me as it was launching that really the key thing was the kids' connections with one another, with how they were making sense of one another, how they understood one another, and I was searching for ways to understand how they were making sense of one another and what sorts of relationships were being and could be built between them. And I came across literature on cosmopolitanism, not critical cosmopolitanism, but cosmopolitanism. And so as I delved deeper into that literature, I found a lot of themes that various folks in various disciplines were focusing on. Themes about identities and affiliations and belongings in sort of one school or group of folks, themes to do with ethicality and morality in human relations, themes about, I forgot there's a third category of theme, I'll think of it, but anyway, whatever. And they really gave me a lens to look at what was happening with the kids, a way into the data, and sort of coding categories, if you will, but also then things that made clear what was happening between the kids. But then I realized something was missing. And so when I developed critical cosmopolitanism, my interest has always been in at the intersection of education and language. So I really am interested in underserved youth, talking about schooling, talking about education, kids who are being schooled in a language that's not their home language, who in most places in the world, in most cases, except for elite kids, don't have adequate support and resources for learning. And so I realized that particularly for those kids, there were aspects in cosmopolitanism that were missing, that we have to think about what the schools and thoughts of critical pedagogy have focused on, issues of power and privilege and status, especially as kids forge relationships with each other. It's totally tied into ideologies around English, around race, around, so languages have various statuses. Kids do, skin color does. And all of that plays into the sorts of relationships that kids build with one another and how they perceive one another and how they interact with one another.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So why do you think is critical cosmopolitanism important in the 21st century?
Oh, I have two different answers. I'm not sure which way to go. I'll try both. I think it's incredibly important in the 21st century because I think that so many aspects of life in the 21st century increase communication around the globe, increase contact between folks who come from different language, cultural, socioeconomic, and other sorts of backgrounds, partly because of technology, partly because of the global economy, for so many things that are tied into globalization. Communication is speeding up the rate at which we encounter and communicate with people all over the globe, and have to, in our futures, and in, if you're, I'm thinking about kids and their futures, and what the future might hold for them if they want to enter the global economy and other things. And so I think it's really, the question. Can I see the question? Sorry, right on tape. So why is it important for this? So one reason that it's important is because people are encountering one another, and because people have to be able to communicate and build relations, given what's going on in so many sectors of society. But the other answer, remember I said there were two. The other answer is that I think, and I think I'm not alone in this, I think our world's kind of in trouble. I think that while there has always been war, and there's always been conflict in various places and among various places, I think it's gotten worse. I think, if I look at my own country, but I'm not just looking at my own country, but if I do look at my own country and I look at the degree to which hatred and animosity and racism and stereotyping and all of those things have been so exacerbated recently, and the ways in which we just have no ability anymore, or many people, some of us do, have no ability to conceive of encountering others from a vantage point that isn't just judgment, categorizing, stereotyping, and all of those sorts of things. And the divisiveness is amazing. And I think that the point of critical cosmopolitanism is to develop, this was the third point I forgot earlier, to develop, if we can, how we can, dispositions of not just tolerance, because tolerance is sort of putting up with someone, and I don't mean that, but of care and wanting relationships, inquiry, being curious about others, realizing that we're all people in this world, that there's something to be gained by learning deeply about one another, by coming to understand one another, and that's going to enrich and enhance all of us. And if you want to be neoliberal about it, as well as the global economy, if we can develop those relationships. And so I think it's more important now than ever to think about not just caring and concern and valuing of others, but of having an ethical responsibility for one another on the globe and for the planet. And I think we are losing that.
Okay, so focusing on education, how can teachers in mainstream education work towards developing critical cosmopolitanism with their students?
So I'm going to give you what I would call a pie in the sky. Do you know if it's pie in the sky answer? It's hard. Mm-hmm. And so the way that schools work now is so much focused on, following a set prescribed curriculum with very specific learning goals, so that when kids are assessed, the accountability piece of it, when they're assessed, they can, meet those goals. Mm-hmm. That pretty much all over the world, I think that there's less and less space in school to be able to do the kinds of work that actually do develop this, because I don't think, mostly when you look at where globalization can be addressed, where any of this could be addressed, people will point to a social studies curriculum. But that's not really what social studies curricula are about in schools. And I also don't think it can be done purely by reading and thinking about it. That's why I have the project that I do. I think that it really takes building relationships of trust and respect with others, where we can be open to learning from and with others and collaborating and sharing. It's got to be relational. And you've got to have the trust, and you've got to have the respect, and you have to be rid of the sorts of fears that are instilled in all of us in our society about unknown others. And so I think in earlier times, I know that there have been many classrooms around the world that tried to set up sort of pen pal programs. This was prior to all of the technology, right? Where at least you would get these packets of letters from some kids somewhere, and you would say, oh, these are real kids living real lives. I think technology actually makes that easier. I think you can harness it to connect kids, to have linked classrooms, or to, I think there's all sorts of things you could do with technology. I have a student who did, okay, so she was a master's student of mine, but she was a primary school teacher. And she happened to be fluent in both Spanish and English. This was in the States, and she happened to be teaching in a school where they had a growing Latino population, kids, immigrant kids who had come and who didn't speak English very well, and many of whom were put in her classroom. And for her master's thesis, she linked with the classroom in a bilingual school in a very small and poor coastal town in Mexico. And the two teachers, and she didn't know, I mean, she'd never been there, but the two teachers worked together, Skype and, virtually, to develop a curriculum that both kids did, sometimes parallel and sometimes together. So, for example, I think they were either third or fourth grade, I can't remember which, and each group of kids had to choose a book that they felt sort of represented where they lived in some way or their life, but a kid's book. And they exchanged, so that the Spanish class or the Mexican class was looking at a book about Wisconsin, in fact, which is where I'm from and where she was from. And the Wisconsin kids were looking at a book about, it was great, it was like a myth about that particular ethnic group. In Mexico, and they read the books, and then they had parallel assignments looking at them and talking about them and learning from one another. That's creative. That's fabulous. And then they wanted to continue it, so they each picked an artist. So I think that the U.S. kids learned about Frida Kahlo, who's this Mexican artist, and I can't remember who the American kids picked, but some American artist. And so then they drew in the arts, it was creative, it was imaginative, and it was so collaborative that they were learning with and from one another, even though they were doing it from a distance. I would call that, at the very least, cosmopolitan learning. I think the critical piece would have to push it a little bit further to think about their own positionings vis-a-vis their own communities and one another, but it's a start. But a teacher has to have the imagination, they have to have the will, they have to be, have the commitment to it, and they have to be willing to think outside the box and take some risks. And that's hard.
Okay. Those were very inspirational words, very insightful. Thank you so much.
There you go. Sure. Bye.